أهلا بيكم في دروس الأحياء للصف الثالث ثانوي. النهاردة we will talk about the support in man, and we will start with the skeleton, the axial skeleton and appendicular skeleton. So let's begin. The skeletal system of man, as you can see here, consists of the skeleton itself, the bones, the articulations between the bones means the joints, and the cartilages on the bones, the ligaments that connect the bones in the articulations, and tendons. So the skeleton, the cartilages, the joints, the ligaments, and tendons. If you count the bones in the skeleton of man, it consists of 206 bones. Each bone has its unique shape. It's the shape that is suitable for its function, like the long bones in the arms, like short bones in the fingers, for example, the carpal bones, the tarsal bones. Each bone has its own shape to suit its function. Also, the skeleton consists of an axis called the vertebral column, as you can see here, and the vertebral column attached below to the pelvic girdle and high above attached to the skull. Well, I cannot say attached, it articulates with the skull. تتمفصل، تعمل مفصل مع السkull. Also, the vertebral column is connected to the thoracic cage, as you can see here. And the four limbs means the front limbs أو الأطراف الأمامية أو الأطراف العلوية. Okay, this is the arm, this is the forearm, and this is the hand. It connects to the upper limb through the shoulder girdle or the scapula and the clavicle. The scapula and the clavicle, and connects to the lower limb through the pelvic girdle. See, this is the pelvic, the two hip bones forming the pelvic girdle, together with the sacrum, which belongs to the vertebral column. Okay? You can divide the skeleton into an axial skeleton, the one in the middle, that supports, the center of the body, consists of the vertebral column, the rib cage, and the skull. This is the axial skeleton. And the appendicular skeleton. The appendicular skeleton is the pectoral girdle. Girdle means belt أو حزام عظمي. Pectoral girdle for the upper limbs, our four limbs, and the pelvic girdle to the hind limbs, الخلفية، الأطراف الخلفية أو الأطراف السفلى, the lower limbs. Okay, so it consists of the axial skeleton, consists of the vertebral column, the thoracic cage, and the skull, and the appendicular skeleton, the shoulder girdle, the upper limbs, and the pelvic girdle, the lower limbs. Okay, it's very well demonstrated in this plate. Now let's talk about the axial skeleton أو السكeleton المحوري، الهيكل المحوري اللي في النص. The axial skeleton consists of the vertebral column. As you can see here, this is the vertebral column. It's formed by articulating vertebrae together. Some of the vertebrae are fused, like the one you found in the sacrum or the coccyx. Okay? It consists of 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae, and 5 sacral vertebrae, and 4 coccygeal vertebrae. Now, each vertebra is separate than the other, but the sacrum consists of 5 fused vertebrae, ملتحمين مع بعض. That's why the sacrum is only one piece of bone. So be careful, please, when you ask about the sacrum. The sacrum is one piece of bone, but consists of 5 fused vertebrae together. Okay, the same applies to the coccyx. It's one piece of bone, but consists of four fused vertebrae. Okay, so the number of pieces, the number of bone pieces differs than the number of the vertebrae. The vertebrae are 33 in number, but if you count the pieces, it will be 26 in number. Why? Because we have 5 used sacral vertebrae and 4 used coccygeal vertebrae. Okay? Okay. Now, what's the function of the vertebral column? It's the main support for the body, of course, by its position. It protects the spinal cord because the spinal cord runs in the neural canal at the back. See, in this canal, the spinal cord runs. And what else? It helps in the movement of the head and the upper body parts. Okay? So it's a support for the body. It protects the spinal cord, and it helps in movement of the head and the upper body parts. Let's study the vertebra, individual vertebra, I mean separate vertebrae. Okay, these 3 vertebrae are from one region, from the thoracic region, and this one is from the lumbar region. Of course, they differ in shape. Okay, each vertebra consists of a central part called the body or the centrum, 2 transverse processes. You see these 2 transverse processes in each vertebra, and the ring, the neural ring that's surrounded by the processes of the vertebra. The neural ring surrounds the neural canal. This is the neural canal in which the spinal cord lies. Okay? Also, it has 2 superior articular processes and 2 inferior articular processes here. Well, in the book, in your book, they call the superior articular processes the anterior articular processes, and the inferior articular processes means, by the way, superior means العلوي اللي فوق, inferior means اللي تحت. Okay, anterior means قدام, posterior means ورا. So here are the superior articular processes, but in this position, when you look at the vertebra in this position, the superior articular processes are anterior and the inferior articular processes are posterior. This is according to the way you see the vertebra in this plate, but this is not how it is in the body. In the body, the vertebra lies in a different position than this. This is posterior, this is anterior, and all this is the upper surface, and beneath is the lower surface, of course. So these are superior articular processes and 2 inferior articular processes. They all meet at the back in the neural spine. See, this is called the spine or the neural spine of the vertebra. So again, the structure of each vertebra, the centrum is the body. We have superior articular processes, inferior articular processes. We have transverse processes, as you can see here, and we have a neural spine. Okay, if you are more interested in more names, this piece of bone called the pedicle, أو الجذع, and this piece of bone is called the lamina, أو طبقة, lamina طبقة, أوراق. Okay, but this is not mentioned in your study. So you only have to learn the body, the articular processes, the transverse processes, and the neural spine and the neural canal in which lies the spinal cord. Okay, I'm trying to summarize how they ask you about the vertebra. Of course, they ask you about the number of vertebra, number of bone pieces, about the serial, and we will talk about that, about the size, the location, and the type. Okay, as we studied before, we have cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, sacral vertebrae, and coccygeal vertebrae. Okay, and as we learned before, we have 7 cervical, thoracic we have 12, lumbar 5, sacral 5, and coccygeal 4. Remember, we are talking about vertebrae, how many vertebra there is in the vertebral column. But if you're talking about bone pieces, now you understand the difference between the vertebrae, individual vertebrae, and bone pieces. Cervical are separate vertebra, separate and articular together, so they are seven pieces. Thoracic, 12 vertebra, 12 pieces, because they are separate and articular. Articular means بتعمل مفاصل مع الفرتبرا اللي فوقيها والفرتبرا اللي تحتيها. Okay? Lumbar the same. We have 5 lumbar pieces and 5 lumbar vertebrae because they are separate and articular. Okay? Now for the sacral region, we have only one sacral piece because the 5 vertebrae are fused together. So they are fused. The same applies to the coccygeal vertebra. Now what's left? The serial and the size. Now please pay attention here. We said there are 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 4 coccygeal. But the numbering of vertebrae from 1 through 33. Because we have 7 cervical, so 1 through 7 is cervical. 8 through 19, that's 12 vertebrae. 20 through 24, that's 5 vertebrae. 25 through 29, that's 5 vertebrae. And 30 through 33, that's 4 vertebrae. Got it? So if he asks you about the vertebra number 10, for example, so it belongs to the thoracic region. If you're asked about vertebra number 23, for example, so it belongs to the lumbar region, and so forth. Okay? So pay attention to the serial numbering, because this will give you the location of the vertebra and the type of the vertebra you are asked about. Now about the size, the cervical size, you can call it of a mid-size. Means it's between the lumbar and thoracic, because the thoracic is larger than the cervical but smaller than the lumbar, and the lumbar is the largest vertebra, so the largest vertebra is the lumbar. Okay? The sacral vertebrae are wide and flat. They want to hear this from you. Wide and flat, the sacral vertebrae. And the coccygeal are the smallest vertebrae. Okay? Smallest. Now about the location of these vertebrae, the cervical, of course, in the neck, the thoracic in the thorax. Thorax means the chest, أو الصدر. Lumbar means the abdomen, belongs to the abdomen, أو البطن. Sacral belongs to the pelvis, أو الحوض. So actually, if you ask, for example, vertebra number 27 faces what anteriorly? Faces the pelvis. Got it? Vertebra number 32 faces what anteriorly? Faces the pelvis. And so forth for the other vertebrae. So from this table you can study the different characters of the vertebrae, their locations, and their serial numbering. Please pay attention to the serial numbering and the words you use to describe the size and the location of these vertebrae. Okay? It's simple, very simple. Okay, now let's talk about the skull, which articulates with the upper part of the vertebral column. It's a bony case, consists of posterior part. This is the posterior part of the skull. And this is the anterior part of the skull. Okay? Posterior part, or the cerebral part, the one that includes the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the brain, المخ. So the posterior part or the cerebral part consists of 8 serrated bones. See the articulations between the bones? Actually, it was an articulation before. كانت مفصل قبل كده. But now it changed into bone. These are fibrous joints. See these serrations? Serrated means zigzag-like. See that? They are fused together. When we get old, they get fused together. They are called sutures that bind the bones of the skull together. Okay? At the base of the skull there is foramen magnum. I'll show you the foramen magnum now. Foramen magnum means الثقب الكبير الأعظم الواسع يعني. And we have the anterior part of the skull, which is the face, the facial part. So this is the cerebral part. This is the facial part. The facial part that includes the face bones, as you can see here. Okay, these are the 2 maxillae, the zygoma, and you will study this in medicine, inshallah. The facial part includes face bones, the 2 jaws, الفكين العلوي والسفلي. This is the upper jaw. This is the lower jaw. And the positions of the sense organs, like the eyes, like the ears, okay, and the nose. Eyes, ears, nose, okay? So remember, the skull has an anterior facial part and a posterior cerebral part. Cerebral part formed of bones almost fused together in these sutures, okay? Zigzag lines, joints. And the anterior or facial part has the facial bones, like the nasal bones, like the orbit in which there's the eye, the upper jaw and the lower jaw, الفك العلوي والفك السفلي, and contains the sense organs like the eyes, like the nose for smelling, and the ears on the sides for hearing, of course. Okay, this is a plate to show you the foramen magnum. See, this is the foramen magnum. If you're asked about the foramen magnum, what passes in the foramen magnum? The spinal cord passes in the foramen magnum as continuation of the medulla oblongata. النخاع المستطيل نهايته هو الحبل الشوكي أو السباينال كورد. معلش ما تضحكوش، بس في ناس بيجاوبوا ايه اللي passing هنا esophagus، حتى في طب بيجاوبوا كده. it's not the esophagus, of course, it's the spinal cord that passes in the foramen magnum. Okay, this is the inferior part of the inferior view of the skull. Okay, now for the thoracic cage. This is the thoracic cage, القفص الصدري. It's a case and conical in shape, شكله زي المخروط كده, connected posteriorly to the vertebra, to the thoracic vertebrae. The rib articulates with the bodies and transverse processes of thoracic vertebrae posteriorly, and anteriorly they articulate with the sternum. See, this is the sternum, a middle bone called the sternum. Okay, the thoracic cage has 12 pairs of ribs. Now 12 pairs. So how many ribs? 24. Don't get confused. 12 pairs. 12 زوج يعني 24 rib. Okay, all of them are connected posterior to the thoracic vertebra, but only the upper 10, see, reach the sternum. The lower 2, these lower 2, do not reach anteriorly, do not reach the sternum. So they are called the floating ribs. Floating أو طافية، اللي تطفو يعني، اللي مش ماسكة في حاجة، إلا ورا ماسكة بس في الفيرتبرال كولوم. أوكي، عشان كده بيبقوا عاملين زي لو في أي injury خصوصا للباك أو السايدز، ممكن ريب من دول تتكسر وتبقى عامله زي الخنجر تدخل في اي اورجن جنبها. يعني على اليمين يدخلوا في الليفر، على الشمال يدخلوا في الطحال او السبلين. اوكي، هنا في الكبد وهنا في الطحال، هنا الليفر هنا and spleen. So it's a very dangerous area actually if there is injury at this side, because of the floating ribs, these two floating ribs, rib number 11 and rib number 12. Okay, they do not reach the sternum. Okay, now to study individual ribs, this is you're not supposed to know the region of the ribs, but I mean the exact rib, but they differ in shape and size. They get bigger as you go down, except of course for the floating ribs. Each rib is a curved bone that bends forwards or downwards and attached posteriorly to the centrum or the body of the vertebra and its transverse processes. So if you are asked about the articulation of the rib with the vertebral column, where do they articulate? With the centrum of vertebra and the transverse process. This part, which is the head of the rib, is with the centrum of vertebra, and this part, which is called the tubercle of the rib, is for the transverse process of the vertebra. Please be careful when you're asked about this. So it articulates with the centrum and the transverse process of the vertebrae. Okay, now during inspiration يعني لما تاخد نفس, inhalation يعني الشهيق, خلاص. During inspiration the ribs moves anteriorly أو laterally. Lateral في كلمة مصطلحين, lateral ومedial. Lateral يعني away from the body, medial يعني towards the body, away from the body or towards the body. lateral يعني الريبس بتتفتح كده على الجناب لفوق وعلى الجناب. اوكي، علشان حجم الصدر يوسع وكمية هواء كبيرة تدخل جوه الصدر جوه رئتين. والعكس بيحصل في الزفير. In expiration they move downwards and medially for exhaling or للشهيق, قصدي للزفير. Okay, so understand the movement of the ribs. ايه الفانكشن التانية بتاعت الريبس غير انها في التنفس؟ انها protects the heart and lungs. Of course the thoracic cage contains the heart and lungs, but for your knowledge also, the hearts and lungs, the lungs occupy the whole region almost, but on the right side the liver also in the in the thoracic cage, لكن separated from the lungs by the diaphragm, الحجاب الحاجز. وعلى الشمال أو الناحية الشمال, on the left side there is the spleen and stomach. Spleen and stomach, الطحال والمعدة, برضو separated عن الهارت والlungs by the diaphragm. So although they belong, the liver and the stomach and the spleen belong to the abdomen because they are below the diaphragm, but they are completely covered by the thoracic cage. Okay, so it provides protection also for the liver and the spleen. But when you're asked the main organs, you're asked to know that it provides protection for are the lungs and the heart. Well, I hope you got the maximum benefit from this lecture, and thank you very much for watching.